Zipper rolls out to the right, pitches off to Taylor, and Taylor's to the 20, down to the 15, down to the 10, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Touchdown, Billy Taylor! Touchdown, Billy Taylor! Billy Taylor scored a touchdown from 21 yards out. The crowd goes berserk. It was November 22nd, 1969. That they came to Barry, Michigan, all dressed in maize and blue. The words were said, the prayers were read, and everybody cried. But when they closed the coffin, there was someone else inside. Oh, they came to Barry, Michigan, but Michigan wasn't dead. And when the game was over, it was someone else instead. 11 Michigan Wolverines put on the gloves of gray, and as the organ played the victors, they laid Woody Hayes away. Under center is Wangler at the 45. He goes back. He's looking for a receiver. He throws downfield to Carter. Who's got it better than us? Nobody!
Welcome to the Michigan Man Podcast on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew, for Wolverine fans from coast to coast. Go Blue and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. This week we'll load up the buses and head to Bloomington to play number 15 IU. Joining us in just a moment will be Mike Schumann from the Daily Hoosier with his thoughts on Coach Tom Allen and his team. First, my view from Section 17 to get us started. I'm still not happy with our performance last week, and I know you're not either. The reality is that when you play 8 games, each one is huge. And I'll admit, when the season started, I had very low expectations. Then the way we played at Minnesota had me thinking, maybe I was wrong. We might be a lot better than any of us thought. Then last weekend happened, and I know it's a crazy year in college football, an asterisk year as many would say, and not to keep beating a dead horse, but it is year 6 of the Harbaugh era, and I expected more. Maybe I'm expecting too much. I thought by now we would be a yearly contender and one of college football's better teams. We seem to be going in the other direction, though, and I hope I'm wrong. This week gives us the opportunity to play another ranked team and see if last week was an aberration. IU has been very impressive in their 2 victories, and they have an offense that is second in the Big Ten at 35.5 points per game. They also have a slew of fast and talented receivers. They will challenge our corners early and often. You can bank on it. Their defense has been very solid too. They are not a lockdown D, but you have to work for every yard and completion against them. My guest today says IU fans are still not sure if this year's team is for real. They know they will have a better idea after this Saturday's game. Mike Schumann from the Daily Hoosier joins us next on the Visitors Edition of the Michigan Man, so stay with us. Here with us on our visitors segment today is Mike Schumann from the Daily Hoosier to talk about a great start for Indiana football and, of course, the game on Saturday. Mike, welcome to the show.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having me on.
Well, Mike, this Saturday, Michigan travels to Bloomington to play the 13th-ranked Hoosiers, and it has been a long time since IU has been ranked ahead of Michigan when these two teams have met, hasn't it?
It certainly has. I believe the stat I saw was 1988. To be precise with that, and that kind of corresponds to the last time Indiana beat Michigan the year prior. The last time, maybe this was a little bit more of a competitive series. So it's certainly an interesting time for Indiana football and a promising start.
Let's start by talking about the architect of this Indiana resurgence, if you want to call it that. But Coach Tom Allen, now in his fourth season, Mike, he's done really a solid job building the program to where it is right now, hasn't he?
Yeah, he sure has. And, culture is a term that is overused in sports, but I think that's probably the best way to encapsulate what he's done. It's certainly what comes to mind every time I think about his time with the program. He really has captured the hearts and minds of the players, both on the team and out on the recruiting trail, where he's done a nice job of stepping up where Indiana, is able to the caliber of talent that Indiana is able to pull into the program, which is kind of what we're starting to see now, where they're, had an 8-5 season last year and they're off to a nice start here in 2020. You're starting to see where it's not just the culture, but it's actual talent on the field that's starting to translate to some wins that historically Indiana hasn't been able to pull together. Allen had a lot of detractors when he got the job. If people remember, Kevin Wilson was Indiana's coach at the end of the 2016 season and, quote unquote, resigned. Never really knew what the story was there, but Allen was the defensive coordinator that season and really turned around that defense. Michigan fans probably remember games against Indiana where they would routinely, run up 40, 50 points. Mm-hmm. In that 2016 season, it was just like somebody flipped a switch. And so, a lot of people thought, what, if he can do that with the defense, maybe he can do it with the program, give the guy a chance. I think that's ultimately what got him the job. But the other perspective was, hey, he's never been a head coach anywhere other than at the high school level. Why don't we do a more national search rather than just promoting the DC? So it wasn't a real popular pick at the time, but I think if you polled the fan base right now, they'd be firmly behind him.
I think they would. You're right about that. He's done a great job to this point. Mike, let's talk about this Hoosier offense we're going to see on Saturday and some of its key players. I know Michigan fans have probably seen bits and pieces of IU games, but not a lot in the first two. This offense coming into the season had very high expectations. They're averaging 36.5 points a game, but in both of the first two games, Penn State and Rutgers, the offense has been sort of getting off to a slow start in each game, hasn't it?
Yeah, it sure has. And the big question mark coming into the season with this offense was the O-line. They lost a few key players, especially on the interior. And so far, even on the edge, the two tackles who people had a lot of hope for, really haven't stood out, against Penn State there, especially in the second half. It looked like Indiana's tackles kind of wore down. They gave up a lot of sacks, which looked at one point to have turned the game in Penn State's favor. Obviously, didn't end up that way. But I attribute much of what's going on so far with the slow starts to the O-line. Michael Penix hasn't had a lot of time, and because he had, really not played in a competitive game in over a year because his 2019 season was cut short due to injury, I think it's taken him time to find a rhythm, and that's just been exacerbated by, not having a clean pocket. I think in the second half against Penn State, that pocket was clean, and Penix looked to be back to the form that people expect. And so I think it's interesting where we're at now because, it's one thing to look good against Rutgers. It's another to really feel like you've got a rhythm going and you're headed in the right direction when you face Michigan. And so I think there's still a lot of uncertainty. But at the skill positions, with Penix, with Watt Fillier, who's coming off a 70-catch, 1,000-yard season last year, with Peyton Hendershot, who's a underappreciated guy at tight end that broke some Indiana records for receiving and receptions and receiving yards at tight end last year. I think they're really strong. And another question that I think is still getting sorted out is the running back position. They've got two backs that they like to use, Stevie Scott and Samson James, but they're very similar backs. They're more of the kind of the downhill bruiser type backs. They're not real shifty. They're not real fast. You're not going to get, 80-yard runs out of them. You're going to get, 3 yards in a cloud of dust. And it against teams like Michigan, those 3 yards can turn into 1 and 2 yards, and you're facing a lot of long down situations where, the defense can kind of pin back the rears and come after the quarterback. So I think that's what we saw last year when Indiana and Michigan played to a great extent, is that, Indiana just couldn't get out of their own way offensively. And I'm a little bit concerned going into this one that we're going to at least face that same sort of challenge.
Well, let's talk about quarterback Michael Penix Jr. We as Michigan fans haven't seen a lot of him. He was impressive in the first 2 games this year. Went 17 for 26 last Saturday, 3 TDs. And again, we haven't seen much of him. So give us your thoughts and what makes him so dangerous in that offense.
Yeah, I'll describe him in his own words. He likes to say that he's a pro-style quarterback that can run. And I think that's a fair assessment. If there's one thing that stands out about Penix more than anything else, it is his arm talent, which, to me, it's just to be candid, I think it's the best arm talent that I've seen for an Indiana quarterback, which, they don't have a strong history with quarterbacks, but a few years ago they had Nate Sudfeld, who's still with the Philadelphia Eagles. But he can he can make every throw in the field. He gets it out incredibly fast, and the zip that he has on the ball, sometimes it might be too much. If you want to criticize the guy, sometimes he needs to dial back his throws because he'll have a guy wide open and he'll put so much on it that it ends up getting dropped. And you mentioned the 19 of 26 against Rutgers. That is a little bit misleading. I think it was probably more like a 22 of 26 type game. He had several drops in the first half. But, to the earlier point, some of those could have been on him because he needs to, at times, dial back. His arm is just that good. Part of the problem against Penn State, and this could have been rust, he didn't look to run. He wasn't, real good with his feet, creating space in the pocket and ultimately escaping the pocket if he needed to. He did a little bit better job against Rutgers with that. He is a good running quarterback. He's fast, as you saw in that final play against Penn State. He can get where he needs to go. So he's a weapon both through the air and on the ground, but I think he has to embrace a little bit more his ability to escape the pocket and run. And I think there might be some hesitancy there because last year his season was completely derailed. I think he started maybe 6 games, but only finished 3 of those. He just couldn't get out of his own way with injuries, and I'm sure there's some hesitation there to avoid taking shots.
Well, right, and he has a really nice batch of talented receivers to throw to, too, and led by Whop Philyor. You've got tight end Peyton Hendershot. There are some big-time weapons in that receiving core, aren't there, Mike?
Yeah, there are. They certainly lost some weapons, too. Nick Westbrook is playing with the Tennessee Titans this year. They also had Donovan Hale last year. So they lost some guys, but Philyor was the headliner last year. He's the guy that draws, the top assignment from the other team, draws most of the attention. It ended up at one point last year where he was getting a significant shade or even double teams because, he's just has such a dramatic impact on the game, and he's really hard to cover one-on-one because he's so shifty and quick. The guy that doesn't get as much publicity, that's more of a kind of a steady, senior on the team is Ty Freifogel. He is already off to a good start this year. He's not super fast, not super big, but he's I think steady is the word. I think when people focus too much on Philyor, you'll see Freifogel come up with a big game. But they are thin right now at receiver, both because of the losses last year, but also because of injuries. If you want to call Miles Marshall a third starter at receiver, I think that would be fair. But he left the Penn State game because of a concussion and didn't play against Rutgers. And so there's still that open question as to whether or not he'll play on Saturday. And then David Ellis is more of a slot guy that could also come out of the backfield. Just more of a kind of a dynamic guy that they just try to find ways to plug into the offense. He's missed the first 2 games as well. So those are 2 guys that, if you're watching on Saturday for, inactives going into the game or actives, those would be the two headliners in terms of Indiana's offense, and specifically in the receiving game.
Well, Michigan fans are very familiar with first-year offensive coordinator Nick Sheridan. He's a former Michigan quarterback during the Rich Rod days. Several of the preseason magazines I read mentioned that there was no question heading into the season the IU offense had the weapons, but how would Sheridan use them was a question that was asked. Do you think he's done a good job with the game planning and the play calling so far through the first two games?
Yeah, I mean, as best I can tell, I don't think that they've changed significantly from last year in their overall scheme and approach, which is what we were told throughout the offseason. Kalen DeBoer was the offensive coordinator last year. Most people would say it was the offense, and specifically the addition of him for his one season in Bloomington that really turned that season last year. But even last year, that offense took a while to get into a rhythm and for DeBoer to kind of find his groove with the talent that he had. And I think to some extent we're seeing that with Sheridan this year. He's never called plays before. And Tom Allen talked about that this week, that it's more art than science, and it's not something that you necessarily are good at from day one. And so, I personally, I don't think any shortcomings in the offense through the first 2 weeks are due to play calling. I think it's more, as best I can tell from it's the offensive line, both not giving Penix enough time and not creating enough holes in the running game. But Sheridan readily admitted earlier this week that he needs to get better. So I think it's a overall group effort right now.
Here with us on our visitors edition this week is Mike Schumann from the Daily Hoosier as we get ready for Saturday's game down in Bloomington. Mike, over on the other side of the ball, coordinator Kane Womack getting very solid play from the D, led by linebacker Micah McFadden, who's a real talent. Kid's a heck of a player, isn't he?
Yeah, it really is. And it's funny you mention him, because the first time he really kind of stood out to me was a couple of years ago up at Michigan. He was a true freshman, and he was making plays all over the field. And most people at that point didn't really know who he was. But Indiana, under Tom Allen, likes to rotate 2 and even 3 deep, and I think in that game a couple of years ago, he really made an impression and worked his way into the starting lineup towards the end of that year. And he's just a guy that's all over the field. He's really quick. He had an interception last week, so he's effective in the passing game. And Indiana's defense is really based on the linebackers and DBs making plays. You're not going to get a lot of production or stats or noise out of their front four, but the goal there is just for them to consume blocks and create lanes and opportunities and get some pressure to allow everybody behind them to make plays. And McFadden and then Cam Jones, who starts alongside him at linebacker. When I think of those two, I just think of fast linebackers. They're all over the field, and they're effective both in against the run and the pass.
Well, let's talk about that defensive line for a moment. As a group, overall, how have they played? What's the depth like? And who are some of the names we can watch for as Michigan fans on Saturday?
It's interesting right now. I think at defensive tackle, I think they're as strong as they've been as long back as I can remember, really, on their 2-deep rotation there. Got a guy, and I'm going to butcher his name, Sio Nofuagatoa, who's a sophomore, and then behind him right now is DeMarcus Ellis on one side, and then Jovan Swan and Jerome Johnson on the other side. Those are experienced tackles that have really stepped up the level of Indiana's play. I think Indiana fans know well, and I'm sure Michigan fans do as well, that Indiana historically has struggled against teams like Michigan and the other powers in the league because of, play on both lines. And specifically for Indiana, I think it's been more on the defensive line, because they've produced some good O-lines through the year, but their D-line has just not been anywhere near to the level it needed to be. And I think that was one thing against Penn State that was really underrated. They had some big fourth down stops. They didn't really get gashed in the running game, besides Sean Clifford getting out of the pocket a few times. And I think it's really because those 4 defensive tackles that rotate heavily, had a really big game, and so far they've really shown out. Indiana's produced 6 takeaways through 2 games, and if you go back and look at the film, a lot of that is due to those tackles getting pressure up the middle and either creating rush throws or even throws where the quarterback had a hand on him. So impressed with those guys, but on the defensive end, it's a different story. Indiana's not really getting a lot of pass rush thus far. They're not producing sacks from the defensive end position. And so I think that's a little bit of a weakness right now and a little bit of a point of concern.
Well, moving back in that secondary, there's some depth this year. Very talented kids returning. Corner Taiwan Mullen, safety Jamar Johnson, just to name a few. Your thoughts on the secondary play thus far for the Hoosiers, Mike?
It's been a pleasant surprise. It was always an area that people thought, had depth and would be a strength of the team, but they had a key injury going into the season. Marcelino Ball is a guy that's started since he was a freshman. This was supposed to be his 5th year, starting at the Husky position, which if people aren't familiar with that, that's kind of the hybrid linebacker safety position, and it's kind of the linchpin of the 4-2-5 scheme. And he tore his ACL going into fall camp, and so he's not around. And people were concerned that that caused some shifting, guys moving from safety to Husky. Another guy, Raheem Lane, at safety is also hurt and has not played yet this year. So there was some concern that while they had some strength at the top, they may not have the depth and may have some concerns at safety. But so far, that's been the story of the team, in my opinion, is the guys that they do have that are playing. You mentioned Jamar Johnson and Taiwan Mullen. Those are 2 of the headliners. Reese Taylor is a former high school quarterback that's really starting to emerge as a junior, as kind of just a tough physical corner. Devon Matthews is another junior. A lot of these guys are juniors that are now, really starting to emerge in their 3rd year in the program. And they've been making a lot of plays, both in pass defense, but also in the run game. And people probably noticed Taiwan Mullen, who I think he's probably 5'9", 170, and that might even be stretching it, but he had 3 sacks last weekend from his corner position. That's not something you see very, very often, but it's just a dynamic playmaker, and they've got that throughout their secondary right now. So as long as those guys can stay healthy, I think they can continue to be a real strength of the team.
Well, one of Michigan's beat writers and I were talking this summer, and he thought Indiana might be the surprise team in the Big Ten East this year before the season got started. Beating Penn State sure opened a lot of eyes, but do you think this team is ready to challenge in the East this year?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I mean, I think it's reasonable to be cautiously optimistic, but you also have to go back and do a fair assessment of that Penn State game. I mean, it got pretty fluky there at the end, and that's putting it lightly. I mean, Indiana played really well, had a 17-7 lead into the 3rd quarter, and probably the underrated aspect of that game is that until the last play, the 3rd quarter, Penn State had only scored 7 points in the game. I mean, that shows you the level that the defense played. It obviously got crazy there at the end, and they ended up with 35, but I think their defense, and I'll keep going back to the defensive tackles because I just think it's so critical. I think they give them a chance to stay in games where a lot of times they just can't get off the field on the defensive side. But along those same lines, if Penn State was a little bit fluky, I think this is a game that you circle and say, okay, here you go again, another top-tier Big Ten East team in Michigan. Are you really there? And I go back to last year. I think people thought going into that Michigan game last year that, kind of felt the same way they do now about Indiana. I think going into that game, Indiana was 7-3 and had some big wins, including at Nebraska. And people thought, okay, maybe this is the year. And Michigan really just dominated that game. And so I think you hope that they've turned a corner, but until you prove it on a repeated, consistent basis, I think you have to just kind of take a wait-and-see approach.
Well, how do you think Indiana's offense matches up against Michigan's D?
That is the question in my mind, is Indiana's offensive line against Michigan's pass rush, because I'm comfortable. The one thing we didn't see in that game last year was Michael Penix, both his escapability in the pocket, but more importantly, just his ability to throw the ball into tight windows, which you have to be able to do against, which I think most would admit would be a superior talent, at the skill positions for Michigan. He's got to be able to really force the ball into those tight windows and do what Michigan State did last weekend and throw the deep ball and just force one-on-ones and force guys to make plays and maybe get some PI calls. But none of that happens if the offensive line can't hold up and Penix is taking shots and ultimately Michigan's producing takeaways. So that by far is the thing I'm watching. If Penix has a relatively clean pocket, and I know Michigan didn't get a sack last week, and I know that contributed. If Indiana can repeat that and give him just a relatively clean pocket and time to get throws off, I think they're going to be able to be right there.
Well, over on the defensive side, how do you think the IUD matches up with that Michigan offense?
I think similarly, I'll keep saying it because I just think it defines the series to a large extent. It's all about the play up front. If Indiana can get penetration, if they can, force Milton into some throws that he's not comfortable making, or hit him as he's throwing, that's how they've won these 2 games so far. 6 takeaways in 2 games. You're going to win most of the time if you're producing 3 takeaways a game. But by the same token, Michigan hasn't turned it over, and I think if Michigan doesn't turn it over, Indiana's going to have a real hard time because the takeaways have really shifted these first 2 games for Indiana.
Well, Mike, any injuries of note for the game Saturday? I know you mentioned one earlier, but overall, is the team in pretty good health?
Yeah, Marcelino Ball, as I mentioned, is out for the season, so that's not really one to watch at this point. That's probably been the most significant injury to note, but specifically for Saturday, the 2 that everybody on the Indiana side is going to be watching is wide receiver Miles Marshall. He's a key weapon, and then running back / wide receiver David Ellis, who I think is really key because I mentioned Indiana's running game. It's kind of predictable. It's not real dynamic. They moved Ellis from receiver to the running back room during the offseason with the vision of him being more of a change of pace and third down guy. And I think, especially against a team like Michigan, that they need something like that because they're not just going to be able to sustain a kind of a short running game.
Well, final question for you, Mike. As we all know, this is a strange year in college football. Heck, it's a strange year, period. But if IU can keep improving, maybe even challenge in the East, make a move, it could be a great building block. A sign bigger things could be in store for this program in the coming years. And that has to be an exciting thing for all IU fans to think about, doesn't it?
It absolutely is. I was talking to somebody on the Rutgers side about this last week. Things are really fluid. Like you think you're taking a step up, you're making a move. Like I think most people thought coming into this year that the team Indiana could surpass on the Big Ten East ladder was Michigan State. But then you look at a team like Rutgers, who hired a great coach in Schiano. They're clearly making a move themselves. So everything's fluid, and you got to keep progressing, or you're going to end up really going nowhere. But all signs right now, all you can do is know what we know, and all signs right now are pointing in the right direction. So, for a program that doesn't have a history of a whole lot of success, it's a good time to be an Indiana fan with that, as I'll keep saying, that healthy dose of cautious optimism.
Our guest here on our Visitors Edition today has been Mike Schumann from the Daily Hoosier. Big game in Bloomington for both programs on Saturday. So, Mike, we thank you for being so gracious with your time the day after Election Day, where we're all burned out a bit. Again, it's been great having you on the show, and we look forward down the road to getting you back.
All right, Mike. Appreciate the time. Good talking to you.
On Quick Hits today, no injury updates from Jim in the last day or two, so we'll just have to wait and see until game time who's missing. Here are a few game day history facts. On November 23rd last year, we beat IU down there 39-14. The first meeting between Indiana and Michigan was in Ann Arbor on November 3rd, 1900. A 12-0 shutout win for us. Tom Allen is in his 4th year as head coach at Indiana. He is .500, 20 wins and 20 losses. Last year, the Hoosiers were 8-4, 5-4 in the Big Ten. They lost in the Gator Bowl 23-22 against Tennessee. They return 8 starters on offense, 9 on defense. They beat Penn State in the opener in a really good game, then went on the road last week and beat Rutgers. The weatherman says it will be a picture-perfect day on Saturday in Bloomington, 73 and sunny during the game. Next week, we return home to play another ranked team, Wisconsin, or at least we think we'll be playing. The Badgers have canceled the last 2 weeks due to a spike in COVID numbers with players and staff. So we should find out early next week if we'll even have a game on Saturday. In the meantime, let's hope we see a different Michigan team this week at IU. We need to bring it against these Hoosiers and get this thing back on track. Next week, we'll be back with our Michigan Game Day show on Tuesday and our Wisconsin Visitors Edition on Thursday. We hope anyway. That will do it for another show. I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. Have a great Wolverine week, everyone. Think victory, beat Indiana. Until we meet again, take care, and as always, go blue. Thanks for joining us today on The Michigan Man, here on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew. Our listener lines are open 24/7 for your calls at 313-263-4842. That's 313-263-4842. Or email us at themichiganmanpodcast@yahoo.com. That's themichiganmanpodcast@yahoo.com. The Michigan Man Podcast is produced at the studios of Robin Lynn Productions, Allen Park, Michigan, and is not affiliated with the University of Michigan. Go Blue!